Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Eve Bratman, and I am visiting from the United States. I'm an assistant professor at American University's School of International Service. We're based in Washington, D.C., and SIS is a multidisciplinary school for global politics, international affairs. I teach in international development, and I also have a very strong interest in environmental policy. And thank you to Kimmage for hosting me. I actually come here thanks to Rob Kevlahan, who was in my PhD cohort originally, so it's been lovely to catch up with him on this visit. And I'm excited to share with you today a new talk and a new area of my own research into the Sustainable Development Goals. So the title of the talk is actually sort of based on one of my initial thoughts about the SDGs, which was that for a very long time, having studied environmental issues and sort of come to the field of international development through something of the back door, I had always in my course lectures to students and in my own work been very frustrated by the ways in which the field of international development seemed so very rooted in most typically economic measures of poverty and of what development looks like. Now, granted, the development field has been expanding their notions of what development counts, right? What's measured beyond just GDP. But one of my old hang-ups was that environmental issues and particularly measures of environmental well-being and pollution seemed so little acknowledged by the mainstream of the development field. So I approached this topic of the SDGs really asking, is this too little too late in terms of environmental issues becoming incorporated? And as I began really delving into this topic, I've come out with something of a different perspective, which is, as the title implies, there's a question here. Is it too little too late? And the spoiler alert of the punchline of the talk and something of what I'll be talking about today is that I actually don't think it's too little too late. And if anything, it's too much. And sure, it's a long time coming. But the reason to still be skeptical about the transformative potential of the SDGs is that it's a bloated catch-all, right? There are still so many goals and so much of a widespread process that I'm not yet convinced that the focus will really be there enough to get stakeholders engaged and participating. So I'm just curious, how many of you have actually already delved into the SDGs a little bit? Have you heard about the process? And yes? Fantastic. This already sets you apart from about 99.5% of North Americans, especially US citizens, right? The SDG process is something that we've been hearing a lot about just within very constrained development circles. It has not at all made it into the mainstream. And even amongst my friends who work in international development, some of the initial reactions to the SDGs are, oh, that's a UN thing, isn't it? And I think that's a very indicative sort of observation that some of my friends are coming at it, from the North American side with that sort of impression. And it's actually very concerning. I'll talk about why in a little bit. So to delve into it, we'll talk about the historical overview, some of the important historical lessons that I think we can draw upon in order to understand how the SDGs may evolve. I'll talk a little bit about what's new with the SDGs relative to the Millennium Development Goals and other of these momentous international agreements that we've made along the lines of sustainable development. And I'll talk about the challenges and opportunities ahead. So first of all, the concept of sustainability and sustainable development. Sustainability is itself a sort of what the development scholar Andrea Cornwall calls a fuzzword, right? It's a buzzword and it's fuzzy. And as a concept, we have traditionally had a sort of three-pillared notion of sustainability: environmental, social, and economic. People, planet, profits. And this idea of sustainable development is somewhere in the middle of the Venn diagram, right? It's the perfect triangulation of all three of these general concepts. And sometimes sustainable development may be slightly toward the social economic side, involving, say, rights and triple bottom line businesses. Well, triple bottom line would be actually somewhere supposedly closer to the middle, but we might get energy efficiency, subsidies for natural resources, and so on. On the other side, we might have things more along the lines of global, local, environmental justice initiatives. The SDGs present us, instead of a 3-pillared framework, actually something more along the lines of a 4-pillared framework. So while we had environment, equity, and economy, again, people, planet, profits, pick your favorite way of remembering these 3 pillars. Goal number 16 of the SDGs also presents us with peace and security as another component of what is really kind of central to the goals of this version of sustainable, equitable well-being. And in addition, there's a slightly modified definition of sustainable development that the SDGs are relying upon, which diverges in an important way from the earlier definition of sustainable development that the Brundtland Commission in 1987 had articulated. So the Brundtland Commission definition, is anybody familiar with this? You've probably all sort of memorized it at this point. Development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of future generations. It's like, oh yeah, we know it like the Pledge of Allegiance in our country. It's kind of uncanny. So the important thing to highlight here, this is my own italics, is that the SDG draft proposes that we more clearly articulate the environmental dimensions of sustainable development so that they come out a little bit more strongly, right? So it's development that meets the needs of the present while safeguarding Earth's life support system, on which the welfare, again, that word welfare is also an interesting intervention, on which the welfare of current and future generations depends. Note that the post-2015 agenda is actually known now as Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So as much as the common conversation up to 2015 has focused on post-2015, we also increasingly are going to have to get our heads around the idea that this is actually the 2030 agenda. And I think at this point, most of the global conversation is not really there yet. We're still talking about the post-2015. And granted, we're only at this point a month into 2016. But we are, I think, still a far cry away from the transformational dimension and from the 15-year horizon that really these goals are setting out upon us to consider. By the way, in this slide, I have hyperlinked to the website where you can see the full list of goals and all of the targets. As you probably already know, there are 17 goals and 169 targets. The UN has yet, in my humble opinion, to come up, I guess I have a soapbox underneath me, but there's not yet a really nice, tight, one-page graphic image that one can fit on the PowerPoint that has all of the goals and all of the targets. 169 targets is just too many to actually fit into a nice one-pager. So the most common image that we will see so far are these 17 goals, right? This is the nice, supposedly concise, distilled version. In the process of creating the SDGs, it was hoped that there would actually be fewer at various points, right? There are documents that pretty clearly articulate that what the post-2015 agenda is aiming for is, in fact, 12 goals max, and probably more like 8 to 10. Knowing that the agenda would have to be a bit broader than the MDGs, which were only 8 goals. But 17 was pretty much nothing got left out. There were not many hard choices made. So I just want to draw your attention to a few things within these SDGs in relation to environmental issues. First of all, goals 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. 11 I'm including because of the urban sustainability aspect. But so really 11 through 15 or 12 through 15, if you want to be a little bit more narrow in it, pertain directly to questions of energy production, sustainable consumption, land use, water quality, climate change, and so on. In addition, we also have the environmental health dimensions in Goal 6, and of course clean energy, renewable resources in Goal 7. So there is a considerable emphasis here on Earth's ecosystems and the ways in which we are sustaining life on the planet. It's important to remember that through this process of establishing the SDGs, the conversations were very directly linked to the Paris climate talks and the other climate change negotiations, right? So in this way, the goals are very much finally actually linking a more global conversation around Earth's resources and the changing planetary constraints that we're facing. So what's new with the SDGs? They're universal. In addition to being more environmentally focused, the universality dimension means that the most developed nations are no longer just in a donor sort of position. And this is really important for development theory in many ways, because it decenters the field of development from the role of countries like the US, Germany, Norway, et cetera, as just being donors. Instead, they actually have responsibilities to address inequality locally. There are new priorities that they also have to face in terms of their consumption levels, their contributions to climate change, that never were before a part of the conversation. The final factor that I'll talk about is the process of establishing these SDGs. I mentioned just a little bit ago that there was a wider inclusion of the climate change agreements as part of the SDG process. I have a slide that shows the various schemata of the meetings that took place. But the long story short here is that as opposed to the MDGs, the SDG process was much more participatory and much more inclusive in its scope. And it has been much more widely embraced by nations of the world. So relevant to all, there's a role beyond the donorship of the development countries. There's targeted indicators that reflect national contexts. This is the official language. We had 100, or actually a little over 100 countries that signed on to the SDGs. Whereas with the MDGs, the process was a little bit more like some high-level bureaucrats that formed a commission, got together, presented their findings to the UN, and it was agreed upon by some countries and not agreed upon by others, and everybody could more or less say, okay, these are the goals, and move forward. But that was a very top-down development process. The development field itself has been critiqued, as I'm sure you know, for being too top-down all along, right? This is sort of the idea of big D development that's articulated, especially by the post-development scholars. There are, in this new SDG process, 11 thematic areas of study, considerable attention also to the historical lessons that could be drawn from other areas of study. Web consultations, if you want more information on that, see the World We Want 2015 website. Surveys and regional focus groups. Now, a note of caution. As much as the UN wants us to understand what an incredible process of participation took place here, I'm not sure how much this is actually truly embedded in local stakeholders, you and me and my civic association and our local representative actually getting on board with what the SDGs could be, should be. And moreover, I'm not sure what happens in translation from those local stakeholder meetings up into the bureaucratic level. One of the interesting sort of pieces of development work, as I see it, is a series of conversations around the idea of participation and the ways in which participation can be understood as a sort of new tyranny. A sort of, oh, I'm going to hold a meeting, please sign on the dotted line that you attended, and then we can shake hands, I'll walk away and do what I was planning to do anyway, but I've done it this time with a consultation, right? And I have this reason for skepticism, mostly based on having talked with folks who were at the Rio Plus 20 Earth Summit, and who basically said, you know, whatever we already kind of wanted, we put into the draft, and we were pretty happy that everything got included, was like no hard choices were really made. And I think that's a very interesting insight about the broadness of the SDGs, and also the idea of how do you participate meaningfully when everybody at a public hearing says, well, I want forests protected and I want slums made into more secure places, and somebody else says, you know, I want an end to war, and we all say, great, let's do it. It's almost as if there is a less sincere commitment, perhaps, because everybody is just willing to agree that it should all be done, they're all priorities, and we can all move on, right? So this is the way in which I think participation in this sense doesn't necessarily represent a false engagement, but that is relatively insincere at the same time in terms of following up on those commitments. This is the most simplified graph that I can find on the website, I'm sorry to say, for the process. And again, I think this indicates some reason to be enthusiastic that there is such wonderful process taking place, and also very skeptical, because a process that is this convoluted is ultimately not a process that you and me, and especially your average person on the street, can get behind and understand as something that is them feeling part of this larger whole, right? And so this is, again, where part of the challenge in communication is. To break this down just a little bit, the non-UN activities are here at the bottom line, and they are informing the thematic and country consultations and the global online conversations, which ideally are filtering up from bottom to top as opposed to top down, right, into the SDG Open Working Group, and then there's also a high-level political forum, a committee on financing, that all then wraps up the input from the local stakeholders and informs the member state negotiations that went forward. So just to get a sense of the room, did anybody participate in a civil society group around 2013 that was working on these issues? How many of you were interested? You did? Yeah. Fantastic. Here in Ireland? No, Johannesburg. Cool. I'm so glad there's one person that did. Yeah, I mean, my sense, yeah, the other, there is, so there's just reason to find some nuance here. I think it's great that there have been these consultations, but I think they have been a little bit few and far between, or else very sporadic in terms of which countries are getting behind them and which countries aren't. Interestingly enough, Somalia says that they are working very hard on an implementation plan right away. Great, go for it, Somalia. I mean, the government capacity thing is really a serious question within all of this. And I understand the desire, absolutely, to get into implementation as quickly as possible, but the feasibility of really doing so, again, is still very much, I think, an open question or cause for concern. So, challenge number one, prioritization. And really making sure that the aspiration of the Sustainable Development Goals meets the concrete domestic context in relevant, applicable ways. So this chart is a table put out around the ways in which the developed countries will have to start thinking a bit more in terms of priorities 1, 2, and 3 about which SDG goals that they should prioritize and how important they are. So this is a relative ranking of the SDG goals. And the print is small, but the indication here is that the higher the score, the top of the list are the things that are going to be the biggest challenges for the developed countries. And that is goal 13 for urgent actions on climate change, and then goals 7 and 12 to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, modern energy use, not too far behind, and ensuring sustainable consumption and production. Whereas things at the very bottom of the list, ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being of people for all ages, doesn't score as high because, again, the idea of these SDGs in their universal application is also to reduce inequality. So there's less inequality in the developed countries, whereas they have relatively more of a problem with climate change, thus these sorts of rankings. again, the challenge beyond the sincerity of commitment is also about the communication and really being able to take these ranked concerns seriously is going to be a major challenge for getting the decision makers at the top level, but also getting the public engaged in really approaching climate change. And as we think about the universality dimension of commitment, and I guess I can just speak for myself as a single American, our country has a lot of skepticism right now just about the idea of climate change, right? And we have a Supreme Court that just recently put a staying order on the president's climate change commitments. So getting the US on board is absolutely one of the biggest challenges, and I say this as a concerned US citizen, that really not only do we need, like, the indicators are going to be a challenge, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but getting the political will to be generated, and to be generated from the grassroots level, not just from the scientists and perhaps the political decision makers, but really to effectively pressure for these sorts of goals to be met is going to be an immense challenge. That's true with climate change. Sustainable production and consumption, I think even more so, right? Getting most Americans to limit the desired size of their house, let alone to think about having the businesses transform their ways of production in more renewable and low carbon ways is another just very massive challenge that at this point there are few incentives to really get behind. There's a scientific council that has analyzed the SDGs in preparation for really setting the macro indicators of the process. Let me break down that sentence. The indicator, there are the 17 goals, 169 targets, and then indicators that are supposed to be able to tell us to what extent we are meeting the targets. So, but the indicators are not yet set. The punchline here is the devil's in the details. The indicators will be set in March, and they are working now to try to come up with a whole set of indicators that hopefully will address the extent to which we're meeting all of these goals. And part of the very convenient workaround is that they're looking for indicators that will be one or two from each category that will help to shed light on the broader goal. So that we can use percentage of women that have attained a 8th grade education as an indicator of a whole number of things, right? But as a sort of proxy for women's status in the country, just to give one example. So the scientific committee that is working on studying the indicators in our progress is telling us in pretty clear terms through their 2015 report that 54% of the indicators need more work. 17% are weak or non-essential indicators. And 29% are pretty well defined and based on existing scientific evidence. Another one of the key factors to consider as we think about what all of these indicators will mean is a global project of data collection on a scale that we have not seen before. And because, again, of the universality and the scope of the MDGs being not just about national level data, there's going to be engagement on this level of getting district level, provincial level, citywide level data. So I wouldn't be surprised that the national census bureaus and much more so the local data collection offices in the context of most developing countries, this is going to be the UN Statistical Office, setting up shop and collecting data in a much more, or attempting to get good data in a way that it has already been challenged to get data on in the past. There is some interesting scholarship in the development world too that critiques this project of data gathering and the sort of almost fetishization of data as a depoliticized endeavor, right? It makes an appearance of the neutrality of numbers and ends up really sort of disconnecting people from the structural barriers and the political upheaval that is often necessary to actually tackle inequality, right? Yes, it gives you something to hold on to, but on some other level, there's still something of a chasm between this appearance of data gathering as a neutral process and something a little bit more political as an endeavor. So here are some, I'm just going to sort of flash through these just to give you a little bit more of a finely grained sense of what these goals and some of the indicators look like. So this is borrowed from the chapter 2 of Preparing for Implementation, a study on the goals. And so the goals would look then for these sort of quick indicators of how sustainable development is happening. Poverty headcount ratios for goal 1 to end poverty. Poverty headcount ratios at national lines. A prevalence of undernourishment. Prevalence of obesity as indicators of public health. And the list goes on. I have a whole, another slide, that I think is hidden that I could show you later, that goes all the way up to goal 17. So these are all, I think, again, laudable for their ambition, and yet at the same time, very challenging as we think about actually getting our head around the ways in which this data is ultimately used. Phil McMichael and Kathleen Sexsmith, some scholars from Cornell University, are also writing about the ways in which this is a somewhat hypocritical set of changes to make, because as much as the UN is trying to get below the nation state in terms of their scope of analysis, there's still a reliance on national reporting. And so you've still got to ultimately filter this data up through the national government, which often is just not reporting its data, or often doesn't really have the capacity to gather the data like it should. So sometimes the governments just don't care to report it, even if they do have the data. Other times they just don't have the data. But this is it's going to be a little thorn in the side of really being sure that our assessments live up to their potential. A brief note now about another set of challenges around this idea of the green economy and the way that sustainable development is now really becoming the persistent framework, the theoretical framework for how we understand the 2030 goals. And again, the agenda of transforming for a new, let's remember this word, transforming, right? The 2030 goals are setting out to be transformative. As we think, as scholars like Tim Erisman and Chuck Okereke have talked about, the green economy framework has a lot of different theoretical perspective on whether it's transformational or just totally business as usual. And sustainable development ends up fitting, oh, my animation didn't come through. Oh, it did, good. Sustainable development ends up fitting right here sort of in the middle. It's pretty minimal in terms of its ultimate transformational potential. It's largely relying on green business, market-based solutions, marginal abatements, commitments that even if, strong in paper terms are not necessarily funded, right? And that's the level of sustainable development as we currently know it. The really nice, I think, imagery around this has been done by this anarchist design collective called the Beehive Collective. They've done a giant banner. I'll show you the whole banner in a second. But this is just a little piece of it that shows the 5 heads of developing countries around a table looking at all of Latin America celebrating its 500th year anniversary with masks of nature on as they truly represent the oil industry, leisure and tourism, biotechnology, privatized water, and you can see the earth coughing in the background as it heats up. And of course, our symbols of nature, like 2 frogs on going into the ark via a conveyor belt, right? Another little snippet from that fabulous artistic work, the greenhouse, with its factory-like production and tokenistic representations of indigenous peoples, ultimately becoming speculated upon within this giant roulette wheel of the global economy. Here's the final, it's very shrunken down here. So this section that I'm talking about is just this very bottom segment. The banner itself is, goes from about the end of the slide projector to maybe just around the white flip chart. So it's pretty massive. And you can see, in bigger picture, that there is this roulette wheel that circles the whole of Mesoamerica with characterized World Bank, IMF figures in each corner manipulating the global economy. So this is that critique, ultimately, of neoliberal-based solutions for environmental challenges. And the critique goes something along the lines of the problem with these approaches to market-based conservation are ultimately that they never look at the forces that created the problems to begin with, and instead they position the market as the answer, right? So it never gets to the root of the problem. There's no attempt to even acknowledge the challenge of economic growth and market-based responses as causes of the problem, but instead says, no, the market will fix all things. We just need to try to do a better job of funding clean development initiatives or putting money toward ecosystem services in a way that we haven't in the past. Another key element here is the ways in which, I've got so many key elements. So this is my third one, and there's one more, in which the lessons from Agenda 21 should or could be incorporated. Agenda 21, are any of you familiar with Agenda 21? Tom is. Great. Tom, I won't call on you, but it comes out of the Rio 92 Earth Summit. So remember, 2012 is Rio plus 20. The 92 Earth Summit is where this idea of sustainable development really first took hold. And interestingly enough, at the Rio plus 20, there was talk about the green economy. And there was real pushback from civil society that the green economy was too much of a neoliberal solution that positioned growth, at the forefront. And so the UN that had been thinking that the 2030 agenda would be maybe called something around the green economy for 2030 or something along those lines, recoiled from that position and instead said, okay, let's go back to the earlier term, sustainable development, which was not a particularly loved term, right? Sustainable development has been critiqued from the very start as being too much of a catch-all and somewhat meaningless and sort of have your cake and eat it too, no trade-offs or compromises. Agenda 21 was the policy document that came out of the 92 Rio Earth Summit. And it was for local-based implementation, right? It said, okay, local municipalities, we empower you to come up with your own strategies for achieving sustainable development. So they've, in similar fashion, said, okay, we're gonna do a bottom-up process of articulating the goals. But one of the major challenges with Agenda 21 that the UN has now studied 20 years later, or actually, 22 years later, 23 years later, is a lack of political will to actually implement. That's the top factor here on the graph as they studied it. Vested interests in current approaches, another major, so they recognize that these are the flaws. And yet largely the process that they've come to, that we've all come to, is one that really echoes the exact same approach as what we had before. This was actually also recognized by the UN Secretary General, and excuse me while I scroll down in my notes to get the quote right. The UN Secretary General's report on the lessons learned from the Commission on Sustainable Development. The Commission was the entity tasked with making sure that Agenda 21 was coming into fruition, said, national reporting mobilized relevant actors at the national level, but it does not specify who the relevant actors are and how the exercise mobilized them. It indicates that the guidelines for reporting were very loose and reporting was uneven. Further, he goes on to say that there was very little support offered by the international organizations to build capacity for undertaking the reporting, and that many countries developed sustainable development strategies and prepared their reports for implementation, but that the Commission itself never dedicated time to doing a systemic review. So as much as there may have been political will, even from the UN, there wasn't the sustained attention to management and capacity building and support that could have actually made this into a success. And I think this is another word of challenge and caution, because not only is the challenge of stakeholder engagement, which I'll come back to in a second, but also it's one of UN management capacity and implementation. And so far, the UN has done an incredible job of doing a more inclusive process, but really communicating that process and ultimately finding the ability to support and engage is something that I hope will be present, but I am not yet convinced really will be, even as the UN Secretary General recognizes that these were historical challenges. We just really need to see a more clear establishment of what the funding mechanisms are, how the UN institutional structures themselves will stay engaged. Recently on a environmental politics listserv that I'm on, another professor queried the whole list to see if somebody could please help her find just a nice one-pager about the SDGs and their targets. And what she got back, aside from the response from me, who had been working on prepping this lecture, was several replies that linked to 68-page toolkits for advocacy and a 90-page thing, but if you look on page 32, there's a nice maybe summary that will give you a sense of the indicators. And she had posted in this query, I've been looking all day on the UNDP website and I just can't really find it. And it's quite challenging. I mean, a good homework assignment would just be to sort of time yourselves as you Google, you know, to see how long it takes to just come up with the full list. It's there, and of course now you've got the shortcut in my PowerPoint, but it's not as straightforward as would be desired. The final thing, oh, there's my other slide. It's the next one, got misplaced. The final challenge that I'll highlight is just about stakeholder engagement. And on some level, I had mixed feelings about even putting this image into my slide, because this guy, Glenn Beck, is one of the more libertarian and arch-conservative voices in US politics. But he wrote a book called Agenda 21, and it has recently been a bestseller in the United States around this sort of conspiracy theory idea that the UN is in fact a sort of cabal of actors aiming to undermine US power. And this is a best-selling book. I mean, the guy gets, so, you know, I'm hesitant to put in, but it's not at all a marginal idea within the US that Agenda 21 is something that is absolutely like you know, a conspiracy by the multilateral organizations to try to upend national sovereignty. And I think this is indicative of the real magnitude of the challenge, especially in the US context, of getting stakeholder engagement and getting more widespread attention to these issues. We will need more participatory approaches to data gathering, especially because it happens at the subnational level. We will very much need more active involvement of people within the process of the SDGs, but these barriers are certainly one of need for greater attention. Okay, this is the misplaced slide on the other goals and indicators. So to sum up, and here's a bit more theory references, there's still very state-centric reporting, there's still very much neoliberal conservation taking place. We've also seen that sustainable development is here to stay. The revitalization of this framework that, you know, dates to the Rio the first Rio Earth Summit, and even earlier to the 1987 articulation of sustainable development, is something that I think is actually indicative of a whole paradigm of thought around the collective myth that we share that sustainable development as a process is something that will be perpetuated perhaps ad infinitum. And this is indicative too of a certain hegemonic idea, right, where we're modifying within the given set of acceptable ideas around what is possible. And that's all based on this framework of thinking less about trade-offs and more about harmonization. And really adequately confronting the trade-offs and the priorities of making certain hard choices is going to be one of the major challenges within seeing at least some of these goals through to completion. There is a late blooming, again, of social, humanitarian, and environmental concerns. The human right to the environment has been appointed. He says, and I mentioned this in my talk yesterday, he says that the SDGs do little ultimately to further embed and entrench the norm of the human right to the environment, and that there's some concern for coordination because there's a disjuncture between the UN's language and much of the national level human rights to the environment legislation that's out there. So in conclusion, these are ambitious reforms, they're progressive, there are some very important shifts as we think about the geopolitical alignments, the universality of the SDGs, the process as one that is notably different from the process of the past. But the devil's really in the details, as I emphasized earlier. There's a lot of important growth potential to be attained through thinking through in very careful ways how these indicators are established and how much they could actually be of use. And at this point, I see very little opportunity to deviate from the sort of blinders of getting the hard macroeconomic data or even economic data at these subnational levels to escape the sort of conveyor belt of more statistics gathering, right? We need to keep development and sustainability as an essentially political conversation. But that will increasingly be challenging as we get sort of bogged down in the weeds of to what extent this indicator is ultimately an adequate proxy variable for assessing achievement on goal 167 or what have you. Ultimately, too, the SDGs are really at a very crucial moment right now. They risk becoming perceived by everyone as a money-chasing, as I say in my slide, bloated catch-all with very little stakeholder engagement. It's up to us to reimagine what the SDGs can ultimately mean in our own lives and in our own local and national contexts. That is an important challenge. It's not one we should shy away from. There's a lot of conversation right now in the field of international development about ways to emancipate development, right? The challenge of going beyond just the critic's perspective and into actually finding proactive ways to help improve and build upon the field's successes. And so I want to leave you with that thought, that as much as I think that there are formidable challenges ahead, that it's also an important process to be engaging with, and that I think there is room for that sort of engagement within the various fora, whether that's locally in Joburg or in Geneva, or in Addis Ababa or in Washington, D.C. Or here in Dublin, we've all got that responsibility. And there is, I think, a huge potential to think about ways of making the SDGs the global conversation that they could really inspire us to be. Hopefully, that gives us plenty of food for thought and discussion. I've got my email up here, so please feel free to stay in touch. And I look forward to, I think we have some time for questions, yeah? So I'll just open it up. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Really excellent lecture. Thanks. Touched a lot on the post-development stuff or and the neoliberal stuff. It's just you started off by saying you were hopeful that the SDGs could work, or that there is enough there to be successful. It just got me thinking when you mentioned about post-development. Just recently, one of the scholars, Manfred Max Neef, saying in an interview saying, that he was citing a lot of scientists